All right, I believe our waiting room is now emptied. So hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Janet DiVincenzo, for those who don't know me, and I'm an instructional designer in the Division of Teaching Excellence and Innovation. And I also, as many of you know, support social science faculty during this remote period. So this is one of our regular, somewhat periodic webinars that we are organizing and hosting for campus, primarily social science, but obviously all are welcome to come. And I'd also like to ask if you have suggestions for future such webinars, please email me those or put them in the chat box. And we'd love to get your input on what sorts of topics you're interested in hearing more about. They don't have to be tool specific, as today's webinar is. They can be, broader topics, pedagogical topics, etc. So with that, I'd like to thank the Social Science Office, Jeanette and Allison and Heather, for their assistance in organizing this. It takes a small village to put this kind of thing on, so a little golf clap for them. We are very lucky today to have two faculty members who have agreed to share their time with us, to share their experience and knowledge with us. Ted Wright of Cognitive Science and Gustavo Oliveira of Global and International Studies. Ted will be taking us through Perusal, which is a really interesting tool, and Gustavo will be showing us Pull Everywhere. So I'm really excited to have both of them here today. And I will be moderating, so if you have questions for the speakers, you may put them in the chat room. I think how we're going to do this is Ted will go first. He has about 10 to 15 minutes or so of presentation, and then an opportunity for questions and answers, and then we'll transition to Gustavo about midpoint. So with that, I thank you all once again, and Ted, the floor is all yours.
Okay, and my presentation will be 10 or 15 minutes if you ask me questions, so be sure to ask questions. So I'm going to talk about Perusal, and it's interesting. I noticed that this session was billed as techniques for remote learning, and this is a tool that I used long before we went to remote learning, and it works really well with remote learning, but it works really well when you're teaching in person too, because what Perusal is, it's a tool that encourages and supports students to collaborate while they're reading, right? So that's something that happens outside of class typically. You give them a reading assignment, and I'm a big proponent of active learning and trying to use active learning both in the classroom, but also in this case outside of the classroom. And so let's see, I'll share this screen. So this is just a thing from their website, but the point is Perusal is a free platform that makes readings available to students, and there are various different kinds of things you can use. So in the courses I've used with Perusal, I've always just uploaded PDFs. Okay, now I've tended to use Perusal in smaller courses, smaller being 30 to 40 students, rather than my 400 student course. And the only reason I haven't used it in the 400 student course, another option is you can use Perusal with textbooks, but it has to be textbooks where the publisher has an agreement with Perusal, because now what's happening is that in essence, they're buying the textbook through Perusal. Perusal is getting a cut. That's where they actually ever get any money. Otherwise, it's completely free. And it has to be a textbook that sort of fits within their platform. And the textbook that I use for IntraPsych actually has a lot of nice interactive things built into it. So they're not very interested in letting me use the Perusal platform with it, although I've asked them several times. And then the other option is there are all these open educational resources, textbooks and things that you can use, and they actually work quite nicely with this because they're already web-based, and you just connect them up with Perusal, and you can set up all your assignments and everything like that. Perusal is integrated into Canvas. As I say, I've been using this for 5 or 6 years, and I used it long before with the Canvas integration, and actually use it quite happily that way. It's a tool that you don't. The Canvas integration is nice, but you really don't have to have it. Okay. So now let me just switch to this one. I hope this is going to work. Whoops, it's telling me I have to sign in. Okay. I had hoped that I was going to be able to just keep these going, but I guess it didn't work. Okay. So the class that I use is, I don't know why. Okay. The class I use is for mostly was a class where students were learning how to read the primary literature in cognitive science. So, I mean, this is actually, you know, this is a real paper in the primary literature. And this is sort of what it would look like if you were using Perusal, if students were reading this with Perusal. And now what I can do, you can see that a bunch of these things are highlighted. And I can go over here. I'm not going to, you know, sort of take you through all the bells and whistles of how to set up a course or anything like that. I'm trying to give you the highlights here. But one of the things you can do is you can look, and so these highlighted areas are where students have added comments, okay? And these comments are often take the form of conversations. So let me just see, yeah, so here's one of them. So this is, you see there's this area down here where this is section about talking about, because these hypothetical arrays are assumed to have operate automatically and prior to any conscious effort on the part of the participant, we call them pre-attentive mechanisms. And so that sort of created this whole comment stream. So, you know, someone's elaborating on this and then someone's elaborating on that response. And what they're getting to is a better understanding of what we mean by pre-attentive mechanisms. Okay, and that's exactly the kind of collaborative interaction that I want students doing outside of class. And, you know, in some cases, they're not gonna come up with an answer. You know, these are papers in the literature. These are students who are in cognitive science, but some of them have taken research methods, some of them have taken statistics, but not all of them have taken both. And they certainly don't know, you know, the basic sort of theories and terminology of all the papers we're reading. I really just picked papers from my colleagues, and the whole idea was to give them this experience of sort of being thrown into the deep end with a paper that you're trying to understand and figuring it out. And so, you know, there are some things, you can see one thing over here that, you know, this ends up being a question that never gets answered, right? And that's fine. And you can actually go in, you know, you as an instructor can go in and comment too. And you can actually, if you want to, one of the things I've found sometimes useful, if I know there's some areas that are important, but students are really going to have trouble with this, what I'll go in is, before they read the paper, I'll go in and mark something and say, you know, this is really important. And this is, you know, a hint about how you need to think about this, or, you know, something like that. So they're not completely struggling. Now, that may not be something you can do the first time you have them read a paper. Maybe it happens the second time when you teach the course and have them read a paper. But I think it's one of the useful things. Now, let me just take you, oh, great. Okay, well, so much for all my great ideas of trying to get this so you could see it all ahead of time. Let me see if I can get back to where I wanted to be here without, come on. Yeah, okay, this is where I wanted to be. Okay, so this is what essentially the perusal space for a course looks like. Okay, and I actually, what I have it set on to show the assignments. So you can have essentially your whole set of assignments listed here for students. I mean, students can see this way. And so they can see what assignments are due when, and they can access them through this, or they can do it through Canvas. You can do it either way. But what they don't see, what I get to see in this view, is a couple of really interesting things. So over here, you can see something that's basically telling me, first of all, how long did it take students to read this paper on average? Okay, and you know, they're taking almost 4 hours to read this 8-page paper. You know, this is a pretty challenging paper. They're having to think about it a lot. And I can also see that there's about a third of the students who probably didn't do very much with this paper, whereas most of them did a fair amount. Another thing that's interesting, so, you know, students can read each other's comments. These comments are, one of the really neat things about Perusal is that students can arrange to get notifications on whatever device they want, their phone or their email or text, that basically says, you put in this comment and somebody else has commented on your comment, and here's a link to go back and see the conversation, so that this can all be done asynchronously. They don't have to be doing this synchronously, and I think that's really important. And so one of the things you can do is you can basically sort of say that you like comments, and so here are a couple of the comments that a lot of the students really like. There's one of them that this first one here is basically saying, this abstract is really hard to read. I didn't really understand what this abstract was saying until I'd read a lot of the paper. Well, I actually think if you don't know a field, that's probably pretty common. The abstract is going to assume a lot of knowledge that isn't going to be explained until you get in the paper. The student's complaining about this, but I think it's useful to sort of see this and see what they found confusing about this abstract, and you can address that in class. Another one is highlighting a particularly tricky passage in the paper, and so on. Another thing that's really useful here is that there's this confusion report. And so what this is doing, they're basically going in and finding some areas and some key terms that generally seem to be the source of confusion for students. And they're highlighting those things so that you can go and, again, address them either in Perusal or in class. So, here's the first highlight for a thing that's talking about a plaid is made up of these two sinusoidal gratings that are at different angles to each other. And so now if we just click on this, it's going to take us in and take us this conversation. And so now they're sort of wondering, what is this sinusoid? What are they talking about, the sinusoid? And then someone else says, well, I think here it's this thing, that's not quite right. And this next person comes in and really sort of gets the right answer, which is the sinusoid here is referring to sinusoidal gratings. The gratings can vary in frequency and orientation and blah, 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 blah. And so, you can see this conversation that they have, and you can see how it worked itself out, and you can see that it did work itself out. And if they hadn't gotten to the right answer, then, maybe in class, I come back in and fix that for them. So I really like this. If you're doing a big class, so in a class of 30, I actually just put them all in one big group. But 30 is probably as many as you would really want to have to be in a group. But Perusal has this automatic feature where it will divide larger classes into subgroups. You can do it manually or you can do it automatically. You might want to do it manually if you were sort of dividing them into subgroups for some other things so that they're in the same groups in Perusal and whatever else they're doing. But that way, they're only seeing the comments of the people in the group. So at a 400 student class, you don't want to see everybody's comments. You only want to see the comments of 15 or 20 students and be in that group with them. It's sort of like a little discussion group. So that's really what I wanted to show you about Perusal and why I think it's so interesting and really a wonderful tool. I think, for this kind of thing, I haven't seen anything else that really, is in this niche or does anything like this. And to get students to really engage with a reading without you sort of there directing them through it, I think it's just the perfect kind of thing. So, questions?
I have a question, Ted.
Mm-hmm.
Has your use of Perusal changed in any way the kind of readings that you assign students based on what you're learning about their ability to comprehend the articles? Have you switched out articles that, hey, students really are confused by this one, maybe I ought to swap it out for something else?
Yeah, it's a little hard to know how much of, that certainly happens, and it's a little hard to know how much of it is from the comments I see in Perusal and how much of it is just sort of what happens in class, right? Because the way I ran this class, they would read this, they would read an article, they would come into class, and then in class, we went through this structured active learning kind of thing where I divided them into groups, and I gave them certain questions that they had to sort of struggle with and as a group, and then I would go around and I would talk to the groups. Each group had a sort of spokesperson, and that way each person got, in different classes, was the person who had to sort of stand up and speak, and I thought that was a useful thing too. And so I did find that some of these papers that I assigned the first time, just especially some of the neuroimaging papers, I really had to sort of either build up to them or just not assign them, because there was so much terminology that was completely over their head that it was really hard. But I did find some papers in that field that I was able to use, and that was useful. As I said, I have colleagues who use this with textbooks and have told me it works really well. I haven't, because my textbook doesn't fit into this framework. The one thing I would recommend, so you can use this for the whole course, right? Or you could use this for a couple of assignments, but I wouldn't just use it for 1 or 2 assignments. And the reason is that it takes students a little while to just sort of get with the program, right? I mean, they don't quite understand. And Perusal does have a mechanism where it looks at the comments. They don't quite tell you what they do, but you can sort of guess. And it grades the comments, and it looks at the number of comments and sort of the quality of the comments. And it will tell students, you had 17 comments, but only 5 of them actually had any real substance as far as their algorithm is concerned. And then it'll give them a grade, and you can use that if you want to maybe give some points or something to sort of encourage them to try a little harder, to actually be engaged and not just sort of be a lurker, which students sometimes want to do. But that takes often an assignment or 2 to sort of get them into the flow of that. The first couple of times, why would I want to ask this question for all? So anyway.
I have a question, and you possibly already answered this, but is the Perusal already integrated into Canvas? So that
it is.
Add it like usual. Okay.
Yeah, you have to go and select it. It's not it doesn't normally sit in that left-hand menu, but if you go and add it, yeah.
Okay.
And that integration does help some, but it certainly you can use it without it too.
Okay.
And Ted, what has been your experience using TAs to kind of steer the discussion and answer questions in Perusal? That's kind of part 1 of my question. And part 2 is, what would happen if neither you nor the TA were in there kind of actively contributing? I imagine it wouldn't be as effective, but I'm curious to hear.
Well, so 2 things. First of all, the course that I did this with, I really didn't have TAs. So I don't have a lot of, and I haven't used it with my large course that does have TAs. But the second thing I would say is, what I learned in the first couple of years is it's actually a mistake to be in there too much. Because if students start realizing you're going to answer questions, they stop answering questions, right? And so, generally I just lurk. I just look and see what the conversations are, use it to sort of figure out what things I want to emphasize in class. Occasionally, as I say, I will put something in ahead of time that sort of points them in a certain direction, or really lets them understand that this is a passage you really, really need to understand. Because if you don't understand this, you're not going to understand it, something like that. But I don't generally respond to their comments, because I found that when I did that, that stopped them from responding to their comments.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Thanks. Thank you for asking me that. I should have mentioned that.
Other questions?
Somebody asked about participation score. Well, as I say, they have a proprietary algorithm that computes it. You can, there's a couple of little dials that you can set about sort of how many comments you expect a student to make on a particular reading, and they have some way that sort of tries to decide which comments are actually substantive and which ones are more just I'm trying to get up to my 10 comments, right? And they don't tell you what that algorithm is, but if you read the comments and read which ones they mark as sort of being good or bad, you can get a sense that they're doing a little more than just looking at length, but maybe not that much more.
What other questions do you have? Samantha, go ahead.
No, I was just kind of, okay, so can the students see if their comments are good or bad, or are those in that section that you kind of labeled that you can only see as the instructor?
I believe they can see for their own comments which ones were labeled good or bad.
Do you think that will be a deterrent to participation?
I didn't find it to be. I mean, because, you know, the bad ones were just things like, this is interesting, or, you know, I mean, they were sort of throw-offs, which if people, anytime I saw someone either asking what looked like a well-formed question or trying to respond to a well-formed question, or just, you know, writing an interesting commentary on something, then it got marked as a good comment. Yeah. I mean, whatever their algorithm is, it's not completely brainless. And you actually have the option of going in and overriding their scoring if you think it's wrong. But I did that for the first year, and then I just decided it was too much work. The payoff wasn't really worth it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Ted, did I hear you correctly when you said that you also spent time in the classroom back when you were in the classroom discussing these same articles? Was that right?
Yes.
So for you then, Perusal was not a set it and forget it, as we say, kind of tool.
No.
You actually integrated it into what was happening in the physical classroom.
Right. I mean, and this was really just to get them to make sure that they had engaged with this hard article before, because I will say, I doubt that very many students came out of this reading, even with Perusal, really having, I would say, a firm understanding of the articles they were reading. And so then in class, essentially I was using Socratic dialogue, except I was doing it on sort of this group basis because I had 30 people. I couldn't just sort of talk one-on-one with all 30 students, but I could divide them into 6 groups, right? And I could talk, you know, give the groups some things to think about and have them think about it for a while. And their idea was, you know, to prep their leader to be able to talk to me about that question, right? And then I would go around and we would have this sort of Socratic kind of dialogue. Well, you know, what about this? And well, if you think that, well, that means, you know, and we would go and figure out what sort of the right answers were interactively. And by the end of the quarter, you know, I was having to do less of sort of hand-holding them through the logic, and they were doing more of it themselves. But yes, reading with Perusal was just a preparation for what we were doing in class. And if I was using it with a textbook, I think it would also sort of be the same. I mean, you know, I do think that one of the interesting things, at least about the textbooks that this would be different maybe in more of a mathematical field or something like that, but in the textbook I have students read, that the information is there, it's really well presented, but it's much too easy for students to sort of read through it and go, oh, this all made sense, therefore I understand it, right? And what this interaction with Perusal, and then what I tried to, if I got to do it, but then what I try to do in class is basically by getting them to talk to each other and realize, oh, my understanding of this and your understanding of this isn't the same. They can't both be right, right? So maybe we need to think this through a little more.
Go ahead, Anita.
Thank you. Sorry, this is sort of I'm not strong on tech, so my question might be a little bit dumb. So if you set up a group of 4 people and they are using it together, all of their comments are going into the same copy of the article, right? Is there a way that individual students can save like their own annotated copy, so that like, could a TA look at a portfolio of PDFs that an individual student had annotated?
That's a really good question, and Anita, I don't know the answer. I might be able to look and see, because I agree that seems like it would be a useful thing to be able to do, and especially to sort of be able to look, you know, in the case of my course, sort of across the quarter and sort of, you know, in some sense you go, look at the questions you were asking back at the beginning, and now look at the questions you're asking.
Yeah, because like I have an assignment that I do with students where in the discussion section, they're in a study group of 4 people through the whole quarter, and they each have a particular analytical question that they have to apply to all the readings. And the 4 of them discuss the reading. They each contribute, almost like through a jigsaw, they each contribute a perspective on the article based on their analytical question, right? So like, for example, we talk about it's Chicano Latino history, we talk about like, you know, racial inequality, we talk about cultural expression, we talk about whatever. And so they each read through a particular lens, but then they talk about them together. And I would love to be able to see, you know, what they did to the article together, but also have a separate record of the students, the way that they're annotating the readings, through their lens.
Yep. Well, as I say, I could try to look and see. The other thing I would just say is, I mean, I started using Perusal back maybe in the first or second year when it appeared, and I interacted with the developers a lot over the years, and I found them to be very open and responsive. And, you know, I ask them questions and they'll explain how to do things that I haven't figured out, but then I'll suggest things, oh, that's an interesting idea. And maybe a year later, I see that it's actually built into the system. So
awesome. Thank you.
Other questions from the participants?
I have a question, Ted. And I'm sorry, I came in a little bit late, so I'm not sure. I might have missed it in the very beginning. So when you use Perusal, do you use the grading integration with Canvas?
I do, but I don't. I mean, you know, it counts for maybe 5 or 10% of the overall grade across the whole quarter. I mean, I'm mostly using it because I find that, you know, if you put these little carrots out there, it motivates students a lot more than it seems like that ought to, but it does. And if, you know, it's just like when I first started using clickers, you know, if I didn't actually have some points based on the clickers, nobody would use them, and they would even bring them to class and they wouldn't use them. Like, you know, I can't understand this. And, you know, if I have a couple of % of the grade that depends on using clickers, suddenly, you know, they're rabid about, you know, well, I didn't have my clicker, you know, will you let me do this to get my points? And
Yeah, definitely. Now, do any of your students like kind of complain about the grading algorithm of Perusal? Have you found any students expressing concerns with how they're being graded on the items?
Well, I didn't in this more seminar course like course that I was teaching with it. I imagine if I did it with a large course, I might. But as I say, the grading, when you look at it, seems pretty reasonable. So, you know, if you've done it and you've done a reasonable job of, you know, commenting and asking questions, you get full credit. And if you haven't, you don't. And I think students look at that and it actually sort of makes sense to them. I mean, if they don't like something, it might be that they just don't like the fact that you're making them sort of read on a regular basis, and they can't just sort of put it all, you know, if you're going to do this, there's sort of deadlines, and I've gotten more complaints from students about things like that than I have about the actual way that this grading works.
Ah, I see. Okay. No, that's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question before we transition over to Gustavo.
Well, thank you all very much. I hope you found it useful.
So Ted, for me, one of my main takeaways, not the only one, from this is that you have, you know, very adeptly integrated Perusal into the actual classroom discussion. So, and I think that it must have some sort of, you know, good symbiosis there, because you're not just sending them to this website to do something that they never, you know, hear about again. Right. So I think for me, that's an important, and maybe it's not the only way to use Perusal, but I do think how you're using it is pretty effective. Well, just from what you've said, in terms of just how you've neatly integrated it for a low number of points, as you say, a low salience, 5 to 10%, yet it just reinforces what you're going to do in the classroom.
Well, there's that, and I would say even in a bigger class, the confusion report is a really useful tool because it lets you, if you are the kind of person like I am and you're willing to adapt what you're doing in class to where students sort of clearly are needing, one of the things I found so hard about not teaching in person is I didn't get to look out and see the looks of confusions in my students' eyes that said, I need to stop and explain this some more because I was recording everything, but the confusion reports you get from Perusal are a great insight about what students do and don't understand very well. Even in my big class, one year I taught it in the summer, and so instead of teaching it to 400, I taught it to 33. And I learned so much that summer about what it was that I just assumed, oh yeah, you can read this text, it's really good, and you can understand these concepts, and they just weren't getting it at all. And so, anything that gets you that kind of feedback, I think can be really useful. And Perusal, I think, is set up both to help students, work with each other, but also to give you as the instructor that kind of feedback.
Yeah, that very much came through in your presentation.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, fantastic. Golf clap for Ted, everyone. Thank you so much for that. I'm sure there's a lot more to say about Perusal, but we'll leave it there for now. And I'm very excited also to have Gustavo Oliveira here from Global International Studies, who's been a great colleague of mine in my capacity in social sciences. And he is going to show us Poll Everywhere. And again, be allowing time for chat. So use the chat box or use your voice box. Take it away, Gustavo.
Thanks, Janet, and thanks, Ted. It's great to learn more about Perusal. So Poll Everywhere is a poll software. It's run online. In many ways, it can do some of the similar functions that Ted was talking about, and it can also do some other issues like taking attendance or even taking quizzes. I'm going to run really quickly through several of these functions, and I'm just going to show you some of the capabilities. Don't worry if it looks a bit daunting. I'm very happy to follow up with any of you one-on-one afterwards if you do want to learn how to use it. Because depending on how you want to use it, you might need to go through some issues with student registration and so forth and so on. But you can also use it in a very light touch kind of a way, the same way that you might use a poll on Zoom, except that this is much better. This is also much better than clickers, which many more people are familiar with, for two main reasons. One is that it doesn't require any kind of physical clicker. No one needs to buy anything. It's completely free for the students. And second, it is so much more dynamic. It gives you the various options beyond just multiple choice. So I'm going to quickly, go through this here with you. I'm going to not be looking directly at the chat. So if, Janet, please do interfere, stop me if there's something I should address right away. This is the main page when you log in, when you set up the account. Oh, actually, and I'm sorry, I should have said this first of all. I would be remiss not to hat tip and give a great thanks to Professor Li Zhang, professor in my Department of Global and International Studies. She's the one who taught me about Poll Everywhere when I was just starting here at UCI. She took an active learning course with DTEI, I think, and Poll Everywhere was one of the instruments that they worked through there, and Lee told me about it, got me really excited about it, and the university was running a pilot program where I actually was able to sign up for like an institutional account of Poll Everywhere so that you can run it with like a large class. I normally have like 100 students in my class. The free version of Poll Everywhere wouldn't allow you, or at least back then, maybe things have changed with the pandemic now, but UCI does have the capacity to give you the access to the full functions of it. So hat tip to Lee and to the DTEI folks for helping me learn this. So Poll Everywhere enables you to create polls in a much more streamlined way than with clickers, for example. It allows for you to collect responses in two ways. One, which is on any internet browser. You can go, for example, to pollev.com, and in this case, I created IS 15 because I teach the class International Studies 15. You can use whatever kind of code. You can have different codes for different classes or even different activities if you'd like. Another great thing, as I mentioned, is that it doesn't require a specific material platform. You can use your cell phone. I think you have to be in the US though. So you text to the phone number 223333, you text IS15 to log into my class. And then there you can just, type in your responses. One of the main uses that I've made of Poll Everywhere, both when we were in class, physically in class, and now online, is to help it move us through discussion. I'm a big believer in active learning. I'm a big believer in discussion as a form of developing critical thinking. And oftentimes students come to discussion without really knowing what to discuss. They think, well, I just understood this. There's nothing to discuss. But for example, with a piece like this, I assigned, a newspaper article talking about misusing Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand. You can really clearly get a sense of what, where did most of the students see, and some students were not. And you say, okay, well, someone who answered B, can you tell us about, what is it that you don't really see? Or those 6%, they might not want to kind of out themselves if they see, especially if they're a minority in that particular question. But this is a way to structure discussion. It also allows you to, for example, have as many options as you want. Here's an example that I used in another class of mine, where I listed a whole lot. This was based on a paper. We're talking about Anthropocene, and then we can have a discussion, like many students would talk about Anthropocene as being something around 500 years old, while several others, 13,000 years old. Okay, that sets up a really good conversation, and some of the other people in between. So these are ways that I've been using it for kind of facilitating discussion. To use it for attendance, you can even do it something like this. This is what I used in fall of 2019 when we were still in person. And I like to kind of make things kind of a little bit funny too sometimes to get the students engaged to do it. In the beginning, they were kind of excited about something that is like Clickers but free and more dynamic. And some of the times what I do also is you can use this also to get some real-time feedback about your pedagogy. For example, in this question that I did, like what is it the students are finding useful? What is it that they're kind of really engaging with? The thing about attendance is that unlike clickers, you could use this from anywhere. You do have restrictions. For example, you can block text messaging or you can enable text messaging. You can also require, for example, registration, restrict just to the people that you've registered. And I can talk more about this later, how students can register for the particular session of Poll Everywhere. Basically, you'd get your roster, you put it in a spreadsheet and you upload it here. So if you're doing attendance, you have to restrict it, and you might still have problems with students who are at home and they just know, oh, this is the time that class starts. They just log in and sign and do their attendance without actually being there. So if you care about attendance, you have to find ways of doing this. Some people do it by having a word of the day, where of the several different options, and then in class, in live, you say, okay, the word is whatever. And then the students who are actually there will know which is the right answer for their attendance. This was an example of that, where I told them all the right answer is we wrote the red reading while reading the Ross Rudder, and that's the attendance. Personally, that's not the best use of it, and now with the pandemic, we shouldn't really be doing attendance anyway. But to get into some more of the dynamism of Poll Everywhere, it's not just multiple choice. Like I said, you can use images, and students can drop pins to mark their responses. And this is a great thing for discussion. It doesn't have to be a map. I'm using a map because that's particular example that I did for that specific discussion that day. You can use any kind of image you'd like. And these images, as you can see, they can really help you also bring up, in a really clear visual way, how and why someone who thought their response was normal or was unique or is not unique, to really help different students, feel that that door has been open for them to step into the conversation. This is really important when you might try, as I've done, to have discussions with 100 students in the class. Especially if you want to also do points. If you're going to be trying to give points for discussion and you have 100 students, it's impossible. You can run this in a small class, you can run this in discussion sections. But if you use the registration function, and I can talk about this at the end too, you can even have students get participation points, even if they're not actively speaking out, if they're merely, actively participating in the polls along the class. Another great function that I found this is to, for example, prepare for reviews. Which material do most students want to focus on? I usually do a review before a final exam if I have a final exam, and then we can, prioritize, in this case, quiz 3, and then move to quiz 1 and so forth, and leave quiz 4, which was the most recent, for last. So if we have less time for review, that's the more recent material. And this isn't just me based on my own idea. This is responding directly live to the students' real needs. One of the best functions, I think, of Poll Everywhere, it's kind of like Reddit. If you know Reddit, then this is going to be very familiar for you. If you don't know Reddit, basically it's just having the ability to upvote and downvote items. So students here, you can see not only essay questions was what they most wanted to review, the thank yous are at the end because the students just thanking us for the review. But you'll notice that, some of it, there's some weird things, like if they're spelled with, if there's a typo or if the capitalization is different, those will technically be separate. But in the end, it still does work out, because once the students kind of see, oh, what's the answer that they want, even though this one, there's no space between the words, that's the one that kind of built the momentum. While other points would still be able to address, well, if you were to go all the way down here, whatever student said, oh, no need review, well, some even got downvoted. So in this case, it's pretty simple, but you can see how different, especially for a discussion, this can be a really cool instrument. For example, what kind of sustainable energy do you think we should focus on? Look how solar got more and hydroelectric. Nuclear, here's one, but also downvoted, so it falls down. So it's not just about listing, it's actually about kind of being able to move up and down, and that is live, that's real time. And as you're talking, this will be taking place. And if you're in the class, you can have this on the projector. If you're online, you can have this as I do right now on Zoom. And also, I have it right now so you can see everything. The students would see, you could do it kind of like a full screen mode like this. A few more quick points. You can do kind of, students will throw in a word like this, and then you create a word cloud. And this word cloud, again, is live, is real time. So if people start to add more Brazil here, Brazil will become larger than Russia. If China starts to get a lot more votes, then China is going to move to the center and become bigger. This is really great, this kind of word cloud building. This is one that I did. This was with a small group. This is a very small group. This is with like 100 students in the class. What are your key words? What do you think about when we studied classical liberalism? You can see freedom, a concept kind of jumps out, as well as several others. And as this is going, as concepts are popping up and becoming bigger and all, you as the professor can be facilitating the discussion. So while someone is plugging in, you can say, all right, who wrote, for example, unrealistic? Why do you think socialism is unrealistic? And then the student can, and there's several students who plug that in, that word, because it's bigger than, some other words. These are great instruments. And once you create your polls, this is back to your own page as the administrator. You can set up, for example, for different classes. Here's my polls for IS 15, here's my polls for IS 106. And you can see the responses, you can activate them, you can change them, you can edit them. So once you build this kind of portfolio, you can continue to adapt it, grow it, and so forth. And you can see different types, multiple choice, throw in the words, this is the upvote, downvote. it's quite, once you get a basic sense of it, it's quite easy to work through the whole thing. Really quick, in terms of participations, you can manually add participants if you want to have a restricted format where only people who are registered can participate. You can upload directly, like I said, whole spreadsheet, so you can have your entire classes and so forth. You can organize it by group, but it's not necessary. Right now online, I don't do registration. That's much easier. And kind of like the benefit that Ted was talking about, Perusal giving you feedback also, you can also generate reports, various different types of reports on the students' engagement with each particular poll or with the whole set of polls. And this is where it's useful for grading. So I didn't show anything that was intended to be a quiz, for example. But a question like this, for example, I could, if I want to say there is a right answer, and I could use polls like this live for a pop-up quiz or in a structured way as a graded assignment. And you can get reports, for example, such as this one. This is an executive summary of a whole set. So it'll tell you how many participants, it'll tell you, which answers got what. In this case, they're all marked correct because I was using this for participation points, not quiz, right and wrong answers, which means that as long as they provided a answer, they would get the point as if it was a correct answer to a quiz because I was using that for participation points. And this really, so you can kind of have a summary of all, these are the 4 polls that I did on that particular class. And you can also have it broken down by particular individuals and so forth and so on. This is a great format that I like, the Gradebook format, which is what you'd use if you want to use this as a quiz and import it directly to Canvas. Or in this case, I use this for attendance back when we were in person. So what you'll see is that it says 0, but it's green. And if I scroll down here, you see a red. So this student, for example, Son Soleil, this student, she did not answer the first 2 polls. She only answered the last 2 polls. So in my case, that meant half the participation points for that day, unless she actually spoke up in like with live voice and so forth and so on. And this is a really visible way for you to kind of also score participation for the students. So they're like, well, why my comment was good enough, or why whatever. You say, well, if you do the 4 polls, you get 1 point for participation. If you only do half, you only get half a point, or whatever. You can have a really kind of clear way to communicate this kind of score for the students. Sorry, my presentation took longer than I should have, but we still have time for Q&A.
All right, thank you for that, Gustavo. You showed us quite a few different tricks up your sleeve and Poll Everywhere. Let's open it up to the floor for questions.
But this isn't so much a question, but I would just reinforce what Gustavo was saying. I find that using participation points like that rather than attendance or instead of attendance, is a great way to just sort of get students both to be there, but also to engage.
Yeah, I've found this to be most helpful in terms of stimulating discussion. Yeah.
Gustavo, I assume you are using this now with any sort of synchronous Zoom sessions you're doing for your classes in the remote period?
Yes, so what I'm doing for my classes, and these are like 100 student classes, these are core curriculum classes. I have all my lectures pre-recorded and they're available on Canvas asynchronously. And then during my regular class time, I conduct them as like a whole class discussion section. The students also have small group discussion sections with the TAs, but that's an opportunity for them to have questions and clarifications, and an additional opportunity for them to get their participation points in meeting with the professor on a regular class times. And that's when I'm using the polls right now. Because all my classes right now have to be pre-recorded according to my department's requirements, I'm not integrating them with the lecture. But before, what I was doing is actually when I was delivering my lecture and I had students live and I was recording it so that students could watch it later, I would actually conduct the polls during and together with my lecture itself. And this is really useful as you're giving the lecture to get a sense of, what are the students understanding or not? Where I could get, again, it's not a quiz, it's not right or wrong answer. It's more like if I put 3 or 4 main points that the lecture is covering, and if only a single point is heavily marked, you can ask the students what did really jump out to you, or was it that you didn't understand? You can, in the lecture itself, see, oh my God, I actually, 30% of the students completely missed this point that I was trying to make. And then you're able to immediately revisit, clarify that point right there. So I was doing that even when we were recording, and then I would just edit out some of those chunks, but it kind of guided the lecture. But you can do that whichever way you find works for you. Unlike Perusal, I think that the main difference for this kind of feedback on content, on trying to think about it for really student comprehension, I think this is really helpful when the lectures and the readings are connected but not directly overlapping, or when there's other materials that you bring into your course, into your syllabus. So that's going to vary a lot by class, but much of my classes, the reading, I tell the students, do the reading so that you understand the lecture. But in the lecture, I'm not going to just explain the reading to you. I'll assume you did the reading so you know kind of what some of the key concepts, some of the key arguments are. And then I'm going to build upon that with my lecture. And I might draw in recommended readings that I put on the syllabus and put on Canvas but don't require. I just leave there for the students who are more interested, which means that the students have core reading that they're required to read, recommended readings, and the lecture that is on all those things, plus current events, plus commentary, plus these different things. So there's a lot of moving pieces. So if I only did Perusal only on the key reading, I wouldn't be able to gauge student comprehension of how that reading now is being put into debate with current events or with other materials and so forth and so on. But Poll Everywhere gives me a really easy tool to gauge student comprehension on a broad set of topics that may include the reading but go far beyond.
So it sounds like you're saying that you use Poll Everywhere as sort of real time. It's much more agile. You can just throw in a question sort of as needed during your synchronous session, whereas Perusal doesn't really give you that. It's not really meant for that sort of thing.
Exactly. And also Poll Everywhere gives you a really good visualization live that you can either project if this is in-person class, or you can have on your shared screen if this is a Zoom class. And the visuals are great and it's easy to use. You can make it pretty quick. There's some questions on the chat, Janet. Should I?
Yeah, so Samantha asked about integration in Canvas.
It is integrated. I have not used it for directly for importing to the gradebook. I found that to be a little bit technically challenging when I did that. So what I did instead was that I just generated those reports and had my TA basically use those as part of the attendance back when in the before years when there was attendance. Right now, I'm not using the integration because I find it impossible to control participation in this remote learning environment. So I use that as an instrument to help facilitate the discussion, but it's the real discussion that gets scored. And just by the way, on that, we were able, thank you so much for the registrars or whoever did this, set up discussion sections on our own time. So I put half of my discussion sections after 5 p.m. so students in East Asia can actually log in. So the students who will log into my class at 9:30 in the morning are not the students who log into the 5 p.m. discussion section. And they can, whichever way they log in, they're participating. And Poll Everywhere is useful because it doesn't require that you have this, you don't need to have this be the way that if you don't do that, you don't get the point. You can do that, but you can use it in a more flexible way.
All right, we have another question about breaking questions into subgroups.
I believe you can do that, Chris. The challenge is going to be about what kind of visualization you're doing. For example, if you're working on Zoom and you have them break up into groups, into different separate rooms, I don't think that Poll Everywhere and Zoom have an integration for this to go out to all the different small groups. But maybe that's not your question. What it can do, let me go back to this here again. What it can do is that you can, where is that page here? You can create, like here, basically you can have a data bank, a database of your polls for one class, or database for a polls for a different class. You could make them for a discussion section. So each particular section could have its own bank, and that bank could have the exact same poll, so that the responses that you're gathering would not be for your whole class, would be only those responses for that particular section. So that could be used.
Gotcha. Thank you. If I could ask one follow-up question. So can you break them? So I see that you can kind of break them into individual groups there, and I could break it out by section that I'm teaching. But is there a way, like if, say, I have 3 weeks of my courses on topic X, and then 3 weeks on topic Y, is there some way that, like, inside each of those groups, I could create like another group, just as a way, if I'm using a ton of questions or like polls, just kind of as an way of organizing them a little more finely?
Yeah, I understand. I'm not sure it allows you to create subgroups.
Gotcha.
I don't think so, but you could definitely create, like Philosophy 101 Part A, Philosophy 101 Part B, Philosophy 101 Part C. You could, and then
Right.
you could replicate that for each particular section too. But to be honest, once you have, once you create your polls, like this, whether I'm running it across different sections or whatever, I basically just go here. I just go directly to, to whichever point it is that I'm interested in teaching, and I just go for it. You can always clear responses and then just start again if you don't necessarily care to save that result. And then each section you can just refresh the poll if you'd want to kind of start it from scratch when you teach this again. But if you want to save the results, you would want to separate a different, what I call data bank. You'd want to have a separate data bank for each, so that each section or each class results will be saved there. And then you can do another one with different results, and you'll be able to have those two saved in a separate place. You could even compare.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Another question from Paul here. I have that same question myself.
Yeah, they differ, of course, but how many polls do you typically use in one class period? When I have a hour and a half kind of slot, and I'm using that whole hour and a half for discussion, I would go through 2 to 4 polls. 4 polls is a pretty quick, and at least two. It also depends on how you work through the discussion. I mean, it was sometimes good for me to have 4 polls prepared, even if I didn't use them all, because sometimes especially when I'm doing this the first time, I didn't quite know exactly which kind of poll format. Should this be multiple choice? Should it be this up and down or whatever? And how long would it take? Sometimes there's a poll that after 5-10 minutes, the student's already kind of bored and the conversation is going beyond. So that one is just done. But there might be one there, people just continue on it, and it kind of goes. What I would say is that also really depends on the type. Multiple choice tend to go pretty quick. The mark on the picture, it also tends to go maybe a little bit slower. But when you have the the word clouds or the vote up and vote down, you can spend the whole class on something like that. You could just, because it's dynamic. It's not just the answer is there and it's static. Like as the discussion goes, the visuals themselves will be changing too alongside.
Well, we've reached 1 o'clock and folks have started to head out to their next Zooms, no doubt, or maybe lunch. So again, I thank Gustavo for that excellent review of Pull Everywhere and Ted for Perusal. There's so much more to learn about these tools, but you two have definitely set the bar high, but also kind of demystified these tools a bit. So I hope that others will see the value that they bring to teaching, and that like anything, there's going to be a learning curve, but it's my experience is that these two tools you know, aren't going to give you too much chest pain to implement in your courses. So I hope that that you will, you know, if you're considering adopting these tools, you'll reach out to myself and Ted, and Gustavo for any sort of assistance that you need in getting started. So with that, thank you all for coming, and if you've got ideas for future webinars, send them our way.
Thanks
Golf
so much.
clap for our presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hasta luego.